così come le precedenti, è il risultato di una intensa collaborazione fra il nostro centro studi e le strutture di Aspen Institute Italia e della European Council on Foreign Relations. Quindi un sentito grazie anche ai nostri partner, così come al Ministero degli Affari Esteri e della Cooperazione Internazionale, che alla pari della missione degli Stati Uniti in Italia ha sostenuto la nostra iniziativa. Ho detto siamo alla quinta edizione. Ecco, essere arrivati alla quinta edizione non significa per noi continuare in una tradizione, ma a mio avviso dà il senso della rilevanza di questa iniziativa, che è un'iniziativa che offre e propone uno spazio di analisi e di riflessione su argomenti talora anche critici, ma comunque di grande attualità, che connotano i rapporti tra la Russia e il mondo transatlantico. E questo in uno scenario internazionale che, come tutti noi sappiamo, è caratterizzato da una rapida evoluzione. Quest'anno poi registriamo un evento straordinario, la pandemia da Covid-19, che sconvolge ogni aspetto della nostra vita e non siamo in grado neanche di predire ancora per quanto tempo lo farà. Questo riempie ancora di un più profondo significato questo nostro annuale appuntamento, perché ci dà la misura e il senso della dimensione globale in cui viviamo. Avremo fra breve un overview sullo stato delle relazioni tra la Russia e il mondo transatlantico, che ci verrà fornito dall'ambasciatore Terracciano, il nostro capo missione a Mosca. Poi il dibattito entrerà nel vivo della discussione su tematiche che sono, come dicevo, di grande attualità. In primis, naturalmente, la pandemia, ma poi la crisi economica che ne è derivata, il futuro dell'energia e di conseguenza dell'ambiente in cui viviamo, per affrontare infine il tema geopolitico dei cambiamenti profondi che stanno interessando quel Mediterraneo che mi sentirei di definire Mediterraneo allargato, che spazia dal Nord Africa al Medio Oriente al Golfo Arabico. Questo nostro tavolo di lavoro virtuale si apre in una fase storica molto delicata che fa registrare tensioni nelle relazioni tra Stati Uniti e Unione Europea da una parte nei confronti della Federazione Russa. È un fatto che la crisi bielorussa e l'avvelenamento del capo dell'opposizione Navalny siano due questioni che non possono essere sottovalutate. Così come il fatto che la Commissione europea, forse per la prima volta, non ne sono sicuro, ma penso sia così, abbia assunto una posizione così ferma e decisa. Sono circostanze che naturalmente rendono ancora più precario un equilibrio diplomatico che mi sentirei di definire qualche volta, non sempre, anche difficile, tra la Russia e il mondo transatlantico, mentre la comunità internazionale auspica che si realizzino costruttive occasioni di dialogo con Mosca che non possono comunque, a mio avviso, prescindere dal rispetto dei diritti umani e delle libertà civili. Sono circostanze, queste appunto, che sono sotto gli occhi di tutti noi, ma questo è l'auspicio che io avverto e al quale auspicio anche noi ci uniamo, nella piena consapevolezza che stiamo vivendo un momento storico di grandi cambiamenti. Direi al limite di una vera e propria rivoluzione nel rapporto tra gli Stati. Rapporti che fino a poco tempo fa sembravano consolidati e qualche volta profondamente compromessi. Faccio riferimento agli accordi di Abramo sottoscritti a Washington solo poche settimane fa da Israele, Bahrain, Emirati Arabi Uniti, che penso siano l'esempio più tangibile che la pace in alcune aree del globo non è un'utopia, ma è un obiettivo perseguibile. La stabilità del Nord Africa e di tutto il continente africano Aggiungerei con il relativo impatto sui fenomeni migratori. Il futuro della Libia e le relazioni con la Turchia sono tutti temi cruciali che Stati Uniti ed Unione Europea devono affrontare uniti e compatti, rifuggendo da inutili protagonismi o rischiose fughe in avanti. Sono tutti dossier aperti sui quali la Russia esercita la propria influenza ed è quindi con la Russia che dobbiamo mantenere un aperto e trasparente dialogo, sia pure dialettico, ma comunque improntato, come tutti noi speriamo, al raggiungimento del bene comune e al rispetto dei valori democratici. Non possiamo nasconderci che dagli assetti energetici alle ipotetiche o comunque denunciate interferenze sulle dinamiche democratiche dei paesi occidentali, molti sono gli argomenti di confronto, ma questi non possono e non devono limitare le opportunità di dialogo che anche noi, ad esempio questo nostro forum, nel nostro piccolo, promuoviamo anche con il dibattito odierno. L'obiettivo della nostra iniziativa, infatti, è quello di mantenere vivo questo dialogo, di ampliare le nostre conoscenze, di stimolare e promuovere occasioni di incontro. Ed in questa prospettiva annetto una particolare rilevanza la presenza al nostro forum degli autorevoli esperti provenienti dalla Russia, perché questa, ritengo, sia la conferma dell'importanza di non rifuggire dal dialogo, soprattutto quando esistono divergenze. Con questo auspicio, dunque, e avendo così definito l'obiettivo dei nostri lavori di oggi, lascio la parola al professor Tremonti ed auguro a tutti buon lavoro. Grazie.
Grazie Presidente, grazie Gianni e grazie e benvenuto a tutti. Una volta, più o meno mezzo secolo fa, si usava dire, ed era un terrificante modo di dire, si usava dire la Russia confina con chi vuole. Questo parlando il linguaggio di una geopolitica che per proiezione di forza con i carri armati andava oltre i pur molto estesi confini geografici della Russia. E questo era ancora nel 1984, per esempio, quando fu fondata Aspen in Italia. Oggi, passando dalla hard power al soft power, è abbastanza evidente, mi pare, che l'Unione Europea, in modo soft, cerca di fare qualcosa di simile. Cerca di confinare con chi vuole, ovvero con chi riconosce ed applica la sua rule of law. È stato con l'allargamento all'inizio, ma oggi è in crescendo che l'Unione Europea tende ad esportare verso est la democrazia. La democrazia, come se questa fosse un prodotto e non un processo, come se fosse una commodity che puoi scambiare sul mercato politico. Vuoi fondi, ti do, in cambio devi avere la rule of law. E questa, a mio parere, è una forma di politica e per certi versi una tentata manifestazione di forza che credo non particolarmente intelligente. È una forma a volte di arroganza, a volte anche di stupidità. Il cumulo dei caratteri a volte non è vietato. Vorrei dire, forse si dimentica che ancora mezzo secolo fa la democrazia era l'eccezione in Europa stessa e non la regola, fuori essendo la Grecia, il Portogallo, la Spagna, mezza Germania, tutto l'Est. Io credo, proprio perché la democrazia è importante, deve essere valutata in termini progressivi e non in termini di strumento di estensione e di espansione automatica. Ma c'è una ragione in più per cambiare registro, ed è che è arrivata sulla scena una nuova e diversa potenza che pratica la stessa filosofia. È la Cina che vuole confinare con chi vuole, non in termini militari, in termini mercantili, ma pur sempre in termini in un qualche modo imperialistici, trovando sul mercato e nel mercato una forma imperialistica di espansione e di proiezione di potenza. Tutto è avvenuto in un qualche modo di colpo. Ai tempi del WTO la Cina era un paese, una economia in cammino verso lo sviluppo e in cammino verso la democrazia. Poi qualcosa è cambiato e di colpo, e da poco. Forse era un processo già in atto, penso che fosse un processo già in atto da tempo, ma in un qualche modo di colpo è cambiato. Ma non dimentichiamo, meno di 4 anni fa, a Davos, la Cina era ancora identificata dalle leadership occidentali, non solo economiche, ma anche politiche, leadership si fa per dire, era identificata come il baluardo, la difesa del mercato occidentale globale. Ancora 4 anni fa. Poi tutto è cambiato e credo a seguito di una valutazione della realtà e non solo di altro tipo di fattore. Ecco, io credo che questo sia uno dei punti su cui sviluppare le nostre riflessioni all'interno di questo forum, e cioè dire certo il rapporto transatlantico, il rapporto tra l'Europa e la Russia, ma anche tenendo conto di quanto dall'esterno è rilevante per effetto della proiezione della Cina. Poi è venuta la pandemia, ma io su questa vorrei intervenire dopo e non come introduzione, solo ricordando un dato. È stato detto è la pandemia una tragedia biblica. Nella Bibbia le tragedie sono numerose. C'è il paradiso perduto, c'è il diluvio universale, c'è, io credo, più adatta al tempo che stiamo vivendo, il mito della Torre di Babele. L'uomo sfida la divinità con una costruzione artificiale, la divinità reagisce e toglie la lingua unica. Non c'era ancora Google Translator e quindi la perdita della lingua unica è un effettivo handicap nelle attività umane. Ecco, togliete lingua, mettete pensiero, credo che dia l'idea di come la pandemia ha inciso e incide sull'economia globale. Smonta il meccano mentale che c'era stato, pone altro tipo di problemi e la ricerca di soluzioni diverse da quelle convenzionali. Ma torno a dire, sulla pandemia vorrei intervenire dopo e non vorrei togliere troppo tempo ad altri. Grazie.
Grazie mille. Sono Marta Dassù. Let me introduce myself. I am the Senior Advisor for Europe from the Aspen Institute, and thanks to Chairman De Gennaro from the Center for American Studies and Giulio Tremonti, Presidente di Aspen. Let me only ask you, we are more than 100 people in this moment, whether the translation, the interpretation works. To use it, you have to switch on under the interpretation tag, the English channel or the Italian one. You also have to switch off the original audio so as to listen in one language only. So I hope that works. We will work 2 sessions either in Italian or in English. And so let me introduce Ambassador Pasquale Terracciano. L'ambasciatore Pasquale Terracciano è uno dei top diplomats dell'Italia, è stato prima di Mosca ambasciatore in Gran Bretagna e io ricordo sempre con molto piacere le nostre discussioni su Brexit. È stato fino più o meno al referendum, no? Pasquale? Sì. Ed è stato un periodo veramente difficile e complicato nella vita britannica, ma anche estremamente interessante. Adesso l'ambasciatore Terracciano è invece in servizio a Mosca e certamente non è una sede più semplice o più facile, visti gli avvenimenti che stiamo vivendo e che già ricordava il presidente De Gennaro. Io direi anche per la nostra audience di procedere così. Daremo all'ambasciatore la possibilità di introdurre il suo pensiero sul problema Russia, la Russia da un punto di vista delle dinamiche interne e i rapporti fra Stati Uniti, Europa e Russia, dove in modo molto generale si può dire che la deterrenza in qualche modo funziona, mentre tutto il secondo canale che abbiamo tradizionalmente avuto con Mosca, e cioè l'engagement, il dialogo, è molto in difficoltà, è frozen, per usare un termine inglese veloce, e cercheremo in questo nostro forum di capire perché e di vedere quali sono gli ostacoli effettivi e di capire se può esistere una strategia transatlantica più efficace di quella di oggi. Ma ringrazio anzitutto l'ambasciatore Terracciano e gli do la parola per i suoi introductory remarks. Prego, ambasciatore.
Grazie Marta, ringrazio anche il Presidente Di Gennaro e il Presidente Tremonti per questo invito. Come tu ricordavi, avevamo una consuetudine di scambi durante il periodo abbastanza deprimente della Brexit, di una ferita autoinflitta, e oggi dobbiamo da qui mi tocca vedere anche come
sorry. Can I ask everyone to switch off the audio, please, the microphone, please, otherwise it will be impossible to discuss. Please, Pasquale.
Grazie. Dicevo che qui mi tocca osservare il deterioramento del rapporto tra la Russia e la comunità euroatlantica che sembra purtroppo non aver fine. È un deterioramento che ci pone di fronte a dei rischi molto gravi per tutta la comunità internazionale. Il primo è l'azzeramento della fiducia reciproca, quasi totale, che è uno sviluppo molto serio, molto preoccupante, particolarmente nel momento in cui rischiamo di vedere lo smantellamento del sistema di controllo degli armamenti con un ritorno alla situazione precedente al trattato SALT, che risale al 1972. E l'altro rischio evidente, ne accennava il Presidente Tremonti, è la nascita di un nuovo asse in chiave anti-occidentale con il progressivo avvicinamento di Mosca a Pechino. È una situazione obiettivamente difficile che pone alla comunità transatlantica delle domande complesse. Purtroppo, come tutte le domande, come è il caso di tutte le domande complesse, vi è sempre una risposta semplice che però purtroppo è sbagliata. In che senso è sbagliata? E spesso la Russia, molto spesso, è presentata all'opinione pubblica occidentale come un bullo che va trattato con durezza perché capisce solo il linguaggio della forza. E certo, gli atteggiamenti, la lista degli atteggiamenti aggressivi negli ultimi tempi della Russia è purtroppo abbastanza lunga. Però noi non possiamo permetterci una semplificazione così eccessiva. Soprattutto non possiamo permetterci di ignorare che la Russia non è una realtà monolitica. Il potere del presidente Putin, che si basa pur sempre su un consenso popolare considerevole, è un potere che poi si regge nella sua articolazione, diciamo, operativa, si regge su una serie di constituency che hanno una dinamica a volte anche confliggente al proprio interno. Ci sono gruppi che fanno piuttosto capo all'ambiente securitario, che non hanno nessun interesse ad un allentamento della tensione con l'Occidente, perché traggono chiaramente potere non solo politico ma anche economico da una situazione di confronto con l'Occidente, da un complesso di accerchiamento che la Russia sviluppa in queste circostanze. Ma ci sono anche dei gruppi piuttosto direi nell'ambito economico, gli oligarchi del settore privato, i grandi managers del settore pubblico, che invece hanno una visione potenzialmente diversa, che vedono in un riavvicinamento, comunque una riduzione della tensione con l'Occidente, la possibilità di un vantaggio, anche qui un vantaggio economico, in termini economici, in termini di potere. Questi gruppi, la dinamica che ovviamente è una dinamica non trasparente, opaca, difficile da interpretare, ma è chiaro che il presidente Putin è influenzato da questa lotta interna e non può nemmeno ovviamente esplicitamente prendere le parti per un gruppo o per l'altro, perché verrebbe meno l'immagine quasi sacrale di zar che tutto controlla e tutto comanda. Certo, qui la verticale del potere è molto accentuata, non c'è dubbio che alla fine il decisore ultimo rimane il presidente, ma egli deve tener conto di questa dinamica dei vari gruppi che lo sostengono e questo spiega perché alle volte, anche se possiamo immaginare che non concordi con certi atteggiamenti, alla fine non li può reprimere perché non può alienarsi un gruppo di sostegno e poi non può dare l'impressione che appunto alcune cose possono avvenire senza che vi sia stata una sua esplicita disposizione in tal senso. L'altro errore che si fa spesso in Occidente di semplificazione è quello di considerare che il double track, che poi è la politica consolidata sia della NATO che dell'Unione Europea nei confronti della Russia, sia un gioco a somma zero. In realtà difesa e deterrenza, incluse le sanzioni, non impediscono il dialogo e il dialogo a sua volta non indebolisce la deterrenza. Quindi l'assioma secondo il quale qualsiasi apertura di dialogo nei confronti della Russia equivalga a un ritorno al business as usual va respinto, non corrisponde alla realtà. Il dialogo comunque, come lo interpretiamo noi, ovviamente non è un premio immeritato alla Russia come alcuni partners occidentali a volte tendono a ritenere. In realtà è una scelta che noi facciamo perché risponde a un nostro enlightened self-interest. Noi abbiamo interesse, certamente ovviamente, a dare segnali alla Russia che alcuni atteggiamenti, alcune azioni non sono da noi accettabili, e di qui appunto la deterrenza, di qui le sanzioni e così via, ma abbiamo anche interesse a coinvolgere la Russia nell'affrontare sfide globali, come ricordava il presidente De Gennaro, la pandemia, il cambio climatico, la crisi economica che ahimè ci porteremo dietro a lungo dopo quella pandemica. In più sappiamo che in molti teatri di crisi la Russia è incontornabile, cioè svolge un ruolo decisivo in quei teatri e quindi una soluzione non può prescindere da un coinvolgimento della Russia. E poi ancora un'altra considerazione che si lega con quella che facevo prima, cioè di questa semplificazione, oversimplification della realtà russa come un monolite dove è tutto chiaro, c'è una linea appunto verticale che spiega tutto e che attribuisce la responsabilità di tutto. Il dialogo può influenzare in un senso a noi favorevole la dialettica interna in Russia, cioè può favorire quella parte che ritiene ancora preferibile, anche per motivi culturali, di affinità culturale, ritiene preferibile evitare una rottura definitiva con l'Occidente e ha timore invece di finire inglobata in una sfera a conduzione cinese, a leadership cinese. I russi chiaramente pragmaticamente, come dicevo, si sono molto avvicinati alla Cina, ma non si sentono a loro agio in una partnership troppo stretta con Pechino. I cinesi sono l'impero di mezzo e quindi non concepiscono una partnership su base paritaria e la Russia in fondo scappa dall'Occidente proprio perché non si sente trattata alla pari, non sente che le venga riconosciuto quel ruolo di grande potenza cui ambisce tornare. Quindi la Cina non sarebbe una soluzione almeno per alcuni settori della società russa, dell'establishment russo, è qualcosa da guardare con molta cautela. E poi c'è ancora ovviamente l'opportunità attraverso il dialogo di ricostruire quel minimo di fiducia reciproca che sta venendo meno, come dicevo all'inizio di queste mie brevi considerazioni. In questo senso andrebbero chiaramente rivitalizzati dei fori di dialogo come il NATO-Russia Council, le varie articolazioni del dialogo con l'Unione Europea. Anche qui c'è un nostro interesse, perché se vogliamo mantenere la solidità, l'unità della comunità euroatlantica, ci conviene sfruttare appunto questi fori di dialogo, altrimenti andiamo verso una bilateralizzazione del dialogo che può far comodo alla Russia, ma non fa certo l'interesse complessivo almeno della NATO, dell'Unione Europea. Ovviamente senza questa fiducia reciproca poi non potremo affrontare quel tema cruciale che ricordavo prima, cioè il futuro del sistema internazionale del controllo degli armamenti e dei negoziati sul disarmo. È un tema che credo debba essere sul tavolo di tutti gli opinion makers, non solo in genere del mondo euroatlantico, ma anche di quello russo, ma in particolare su quello degli opinion makers dei paesi che non sono nucleari, non sono potenze nucleari. Non dimentichiamo che noi abbiamo sempre accettato come Italia la realtà della dimensione nucleare, mantenendo viva la speranza, il progetto di arrivare a un mondo denuclearizzato. Io ricordo, questo è un ricordo dei miei primi anni di carriera, quando ero la prima volta alla NATO, un consiglio atlantico che durò fino a tarda notte perché l'allora ministro degli esteri italiano, che era Giulio Andreotti, decise di combattere una battaglia per una semplice frase che voleva si aggiungesse al comunicato in cui si parlava del ruolo fondamentale della deterrenza nucleare per la sicurezza transatlantica. E lui insisté perché venisse aggiunta la frase for the foreseeable future. Diceva non c'è ragione perché noi, potenze nucleari, dobbiamo accettare questa prospettiva della deterrenza nucleare, del mondo nucleare sub specie eternitatis, cioè fino alla fine dei nostri giorni. E in maniera analoga penso che senza recuperare attraverso il dialogo un minimo di fiducia non potremo mai ovviamente avere la tranquillità per porci con sufficiente lucidità strategica il tema del ruolo internazionale di Mosca nel XXI secolo. Questo è un tema che abbiamo ignorato dopo la fine dell'Unione Sovietica. Abbiamo chiaramente portato avanti quell'agenda a cui si riferiva il presidente Tremonti di ampliamento dei confini dell'Unione Europea, ma non ci siamo posti il problema della collocazione di un nostro vicino che, anche se non ha più la possibilità di stabilire quali sono le proprie frontiere, di decidere con chi confina, comunque è lì, è in Europa, non scomparirà e dovremo ovviamente con lui continuare a fare i conti per il futuro. E se non ci poniamo il problema di qual è la collocazione strategica, la propria collocazione strategica che Mosca può accettare, non riusciremo ovviamente a risolvere questa equazione. E io sono convinto, per chiudere questa introduzione, sono convinto e credo che la storia lo dimostri, che le aperture italiane al dialogo nei confronti di Mosca non sono mai state, per mutuare un'espressione del cancelliere von Bülow, non sono mai stati dei giri di valzer. Ma al contrario sono sempre stati un contributo, hanno sempre voluto essere un contributo concreto all'interesse strategico di lungo periodo di tutta la comunità transatlantica. Ecco Marta, io mi fermerei qui, così c'è spazio per un po' di interazione.
Thanks a lot, Pasquale. Maybe we can switch to English now, because apparently it's not so easy to follow the translation. There are noises behind, so let me switch to English, and we can now enter a very short period of question and answers with you. I would suggest that whoever is interested in taking the floor could use either the chat or the raise hand command. I will start with one first question so as to allow you time to enter this debate. Maybe, Pasquale, you alluded to the need for a comprehensive perception of Russian domestic politics. You underlined that our view of Russia is maybe too one-sided, and this has a role in the difficulties we are getting in the relationship between Russia and the West, Europe and the United States. But you left aside the economy chapter. So maybe before we switch to that session later on, maybe you could say a word on that. What do you think? Because Russia, under the double impact of the declining oil prices and COVID, is having a difficult period in economic terms. How this is going to impact on foreign policy choices and on the domestic solidity of Russia, because on the one hand, you could say Russia is much weaker than we tend to think in general. On the other hand, you could conclude that precisely for that reason, Putin has to use a nationalist card as a sort of compensation so as to get enough domestic consensus behind him. So please, which is your impression as far as the economy is concerned?
Yes, thank you, Marta. First of all, let me specify that my point was not much that we have a one-sided vision of Russia. This is, I think, inevitable, but we have an oversimplified vision of Russia. Yeah. Now, coming to the economy, of course, pandemic will exact a rather heavy toll in Russia too, maybe not as big as the one that we are registering in the Western Hemisphere, in the Western world in general. The official figure for recession is at the moment is 4.9%, and different estimates oscillate, move from 4.5 to 6.5%. So considerable, but not as big as we are experiencing in the West, but definitely bigger than many other BRICS countries. So this poses a problem for Putin. Putin had a very ambitious plan, was 12 national plans to give a boost to the economy and to make the economy grow in a less sluggish way, which has been the case for the last 10 years, or maybe 7, 8 years. So now the contraction of the economy will, of course, detract resources for this 12 national plans, was basically infrastructures, health system, schooling, and so on. So very important for the consensus in the country. You say that he might revert to different strategies, maybe with more nationalistic attitudes in foreign policy to compensate. Of course, this is possible. It is possible, particularly if, in case of new sanctions, some further economic damage will be registered. Particularly, the danger is that further sanctions could lead to a downgrading from the rating agencies, and this would be certainly a blow for the value of the ruble, but in general for the standing of the Russian economy. Anyway, in the meantime, the economy is picking up, is recovering, thanks particularly to consumption, to the demand side. The supply side is less resilient, and particularly investments are lagging behind. Then there is the big question of the price of oil, which it's the big question mark for the future of the economy. One upside is paradoxically is the fact that the Russian economy is based 80% on big companies, big enterprises, or maybe even more than 80%, something between 80 and 83%. And this has reduced somehow the impact of the crisis, because big companies have financial clout, and so they are more resilient now to face a phase of problems of liquidity in general. Whereas we know that small and medium companies, although very lively, active, and with big potential, they have less capacity from the financial point of view. So all in all, I think the jury is still out. We don't know how permanent the damage to the economy will be. Depends very much on the price of oil, depends on further sanctions. And so this will eventually lead Putin to take countermeasures or not.
I've seen in my mail that we have two persons who would like to intervene from the audience. First, Alice Wilson, please introduce yourself at the very beginning for your question to Ambassador Terracciano. Alice. We don't hear you, so maybe I move to the following one from Paolo Genovese.
Good evening. Thank you very much to give me the floor. And I just have 3 considerations, very quick. First at all, I would like to remind that very often the European forget that Russia is Asia. Part is Asia, but the mindset is mostly Asian. So we have here His Excellency Mr. Terracciano, who can teach us how the diplomacy should consider this kind of Asian mindset. I live in China, and this is a very sensitive issue because very often the European system consider China, Russia, and many Asian countries with the same mindset than European, which actually is not. The second point, we have President Tremonti, who is a very high-level historian between many talents. And I would like to remind that in history, the relationship in between China and Russia are always very sensitive, sometimes very deep, like in the 50s, and sometimes with a very strong conflict. But in both of the cases, we are in front of a very two big power. And this one cannot be have to be considered very well in all the relationship in between Europe and the Asian world. The third point, I'm not very expert about Russian, but what I'm very clear about Russian is that the Russian people are extremely talented. For example, in IT, information technology, we are in front of the top in the world. And also in many other factors, in many other technologies, for example. I don't think that Russia is an outdated country, but is a huge player in this geopolitical environment. So my question and consideration consider the point that Russia and China have to be carefully considered, and sometimes to switch our European mind in front of the Asian mentality could be very useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paolo. I find your idea that Russia is mostly from an Asian mentality really questionable.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to discuss.
The point is precisely the conflict between a pro-Asian school of thinking and a pro-European one, but I leave to Pasquale Terracciano to reply to your points. Please.
Yes, there is a very interesting book by Vittorio Strada, which defines very well what is the true spirit of Russian culture, which is a Euro-Asiatic spirit. The uniqueness, I would say, of the Russian frame of mind is rooted in this idea that Russia is a world apart, because it's at the same time Europe and Asia. But eventually, I must say that if you go to Vladivostok in the Far East of Russia, you will find yourself in a European city. So I think that this idea of Eurasia is more a rather instrumental way to justify a sort of imperial approach that was taken by Russia historically. But the culture is rooted in Europe. This is why I believe that the Russians, they feel more at ease when they deal with, in spite of all the difficulties, when they deal with Westerners than when they deal with Chinese. And I think that the big mistake that is done in some quarters of the transatlantic community is to forget the lesson that Henry Kissinger left us when he would state that the distance between Washington and Moscow at any time should always be, and the distance between Washington and Beijing had always to be shorter than the distance between Moscow and Beijing. And I think that this is why I firmly believe in the benefit of resuming a constructive dialogue and structured dialogue with Russia, because there is an underlining, maybe we can't say common values, but certainly common features of our cultures. And now, regarding the technological advance, the technological capabilities of Russia, this is certainly true. we have here some excellence in all fields of science, applied sciences as well. There is only one, but there is a limit. The limit is, once again, is the centralization of the economy. The fact that you have this developed also at level of big corporations. You don't have that the strength and dynamics which is given that by the small startups that are inevitably small companies, that they prosper on, and they in their turn they create a productive environment for an evolution, a positive evolution of the civil society. This is why, for example, that I've been fighting, unfortunately without success so far, to resume a program that used to be run by the EBRD, was called the Russia Small Business Fund, to help the growth of small companies in Russia. I believe that this is the best way to invest in the future, to help Russia to evolve and get closer to our values as a society. And even those partners such as Poland, Baltic states, and so on, they should really consider again and decide whether they prefer to have forever a aggressive and disgruntled neighbor, or prefer to have a neighbor which has evolved towards our values and with which you can have a constructive and productive economic, not only political, but also economic relation.
You alluded to, Pasquale, you alluded to differences in between European countries vis-a-vis Russia. Certainly geography plays a role on that, together with history. At the same time, we have been able, as Europeans, to keep a sort of unity around sanctions and also in front of new crises. What do you think of the most recent one, the Belarus crisis? This is part of these conflicts in a sort of shared neighborhood we have. And the European Council yesterday night was in the end able to approve sanctions again. This is one of the few policy tools apparently that we have. In any case, we approved sanctions against Belarus officials, except for Lukashenko. But which is, in your view, the European, how would you define the European policy vis-a-vis Russia? Do you think that we can really reach a sort of consensual policy, or are there too many differences to be able to produce something effective?
Well, first of all, I think that we managed to keep a certain degree, a reasonable degree of unity within the European Union, basically thanks to our sense of responsibility, because although we do not really love sanctions, we don't always believe that historically they are a successful tool, but we understood that a sign had to be given to Russia, and a sign had to be given in the spirit of unity. At the same time, we didn't get much response when we have been stressing that the double track is called double because there are two tracks. So there is deterrence, defense, sanctions, but there is also dialogue. And I must regret too often, at any time that we have tried to suggest some new form of dialogue, new opportunity of dialogue, the answer has been no, this is not the right moment, this would be a wrong political sign, this would be reverting to business as usual. And I think that this in the long run should not be considered acceptable. So if there is some flexibility on our side, there should be flexibility also on the other side when we speak about a dialogue. Now, regarding Belarus, I'm happy that the High Representative Borrell said that we should not repeat the same mistakes that were done on both sides during the Ukrainian crisis. So now it is important to favor a positive evolution of this very dangerous crisis. Of course, we have to consider, to come to a positive conclusion, we have also to understand the point of view of Russia, which doesn't mean that we have to agree, of course, with Russia, but understand that for Russia, this is a vital space. It's the only buffer which is left between Russia and NATO and European Union, which have been enlarging their borders and moving towards east. The Union of States, which is the sort of union that Putin has been trying to creating between Russia and Belarus, is one of the major political and economic investments of Russia. So, of course, Moscow is not ready to throw it away easily. And then the second point is the importance for Putin to avoid the Maidan scenario, which is the change by the people in the street of a regime, because this could be, of course, seen as a precedent, and this conflicts with the theory of legitimacy of power that they cherish in the Kremlin. So Lukashenko is considered someone who has to give way, he has to go, no longer reflects the will of the people, but this should happen in an orderly manner through a constitutional reform and through new elections, not through a Maidan-like scenario. So I think that at the moment is the attitude of the European Union is the only possible attitude, but one should really try to avoid that once again some partners in the East hijack the process to settle, to score points or settle, some past grievances that they might reasonably have towards Russia.
Thanks a lot indeed. Maybe one last question, because this is the Transatlantic Forum on Russia, and we will have in the second session this afternoon Chris Robinson from the State Department. So it's very important to discuss how Europe and the United States can have a coherent strategy. In a sense, there is some paradox here, because each successive American administration has been trying to reset, quote unquote, the relationship to Russia. That meaning that the second track, the dialogue, could have been restarted, but each of them was unable to do that for different reasons, also for domestic reasons in the case of the Trump administration. And yet, I think that precisely to avoid the kind of differences among European powers that you were alluding to, we will need to have a more coherent Western strategy vis-a-vis Russia. Do you think that your American colleague in Moscow would share the view that we can have a more cohesive policy, especially in those fields that are more worrying for Western societies? I'm talking of, I don't know, cyber security, domestic interferences, all these new kinds of non-conventional threats that are becoming very worrying for our societies.
Well, look, I think that we have been talking a lot about dialogue. I think that the more you differ from the counterpart, the more you need dialogue. The more problems you have, the more accusation you can put forward, the more you need dialogue, the more you need confrontation. dialectical confrontation, of course. So personally, for example, I don't understand why we don't take for face value the declarations that we receive from Moscow, that they are ready to establish consultation on cybersecurity. They are ready to establish consultations of foreign interferences in the electoral processes and so on. I know that, of course, the answer is, but because they are the wrongdoers, so we don't sit at the table with the wrongdoers. But I think this is short-sighted because, again, this ignores the dynamic, the internal dynamic that you have here in Russia. And so they, for example, if you start a consultation on cybersecurity, and you can, of course, point out some malignant activities that are somehow responsibility, direct or indirect, of Moscow, you can help the more cooperative sector of the Russian establishment to rein in those who, on the contrary, are more.
We don't hear you any longer, Pasquale.
Do them this exercise having some good cards in their hands, not only bad cards. So this could be a positive influence in the internal dynamic. And also regarding, but overall, there is an issue. Before you can speak of reset, you have to establish a minimum, a modicum of mutual trust, which is now totally absent. And I believe that, for example, this negotiations such as the New START treaty extension could be a good opportunity to try to do something in this sense.
Thank you.
Establishing a minimum of mutual trust.
Yeah,
and
let's start.
You can have a reset.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pasquale. I really enjoyed your remarks and your replies. And so I hope that all our members here, panelists, and the audience were happy to listen from you. Let's try to start from start, in a sense. We will have, yes, an important problem to be confronted next spring, if I'm not wrong, when the old START treaty is going to expire, and this will be a very important challenge for the US and Russia, and as a consequence for European security. But now thanking you again, I give the floor to Antonella Scott. She's going to chair the first session of our meeting on the pandemic, energy. Giulio Tremonti told us that he would like to come back on the pandemic point. So we will see. Please, Antonella, you have the floor.
Buongiorno, good afternoon. Thank you, Marta. I'm Antonella Scott and I work for Il Sole 24 Ore, Italy's financial daily. The focus of our panel is really huge. Pandemic, economic crisis, energy. Huge are the uncertainties affecting each one of us with a virus which is not going away and which keeps increasing the economic price the world is paying for that. Since our forum is about Russia and Western relations with Russia, the way this crisis could alter the future of energy in all its expressions is also a key issue. Ever since coronavirus has entered our lives, I keep thinking that maybe for the first time ever, maybe all the world is facing a common threat, which is no one's fault, which has not been created by a group of countries against others. This is a shared problem which should have united us in grief, in fighting a common enemy, in looking for answers. Yes, yet it looks like we are wasting this chance. I think the interventions of our speakers will underline how divided we are in this search for ways to protect people in the economic crisis, for better uses of energy, for solutions to geopolitical crisis we see which keep multiplying, as speakers before us have already underlined. So I would like to give the word to our first speaker of our panel, Oksana Antonenko. She is Director for Global Risk Analysis at the Control Risks Group and Visiting Senior Fellow Institute of Global Affairs at the London School of Economic and Political Science. Oksana will tell us how COVID can change the basis of Russian-Western relations, with new clouds, black swans, appearing over the horizon, and the missed opportunities. Who stands to lose more in all this? Please, Mrs. Antonenko.
Yes, thank you very much, Antonella, and thank you for inviting me. It is really a challenging task to follow Ambassador, who gave a fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it very much, including touching on some of the themes that I was planning to touch. So I will probably repeat a few things that were already discussed, and also try to cover such a lot of issues in just 5 minutes. But I will try my best and try to also not to speak too fast. So the first point I guess one can make is that the COVID has actually not had overall, not only in the context of the Russian-Western relations, but more generally, less of a revolutionary impact on the world than we were hoping or expecting, but actually accelerated a lot of already pre-existing trends. And in the context of the Russian-Western relations, clearly those pre-existing trends, as the ambassador pointed out quite correctly, were quite negative and worrying prior to COVID. And far from taking opportunity to reverse that dynamic, actually COVID has accelerated those trends. And why is that the case? I mean, I would probably point out to three important issues. The first one, of course, is that COVID has really distracted attention, I think, in both Russia, Europe and in the United States from kind of international agenda, and really focused it much more internally on the internal issues. Therefore, some of the opportunities for perhaps small breakthroughs in relationships. For example, we have now for 2 months quite a remarkable ceasefire in Donbass in eastern Ukraine, something which we were trying to achieve now for many years. And this ceasefire is holding. The number of violations of ceasefire has reduced from 700 a day to less than 20 a day. In a different context without COVID, perhaps we could have used that as a way to kind of try to consolidate those achievements and move the relationship forward. But I think everyone is now so much preoccupied with internal issues. And similarly, conflict now in Nagorno-Karabakh, something which many people were predicting for a long time. Again, we do not really have a bandwidth, given the internal crisis, with the fact that we are facing the second wave of COVID, to really address that in a cooperative manner, even though the interests of Russia, Europe, and United States clearly coincide of trying to contain the proliferation of this conflict. So this is one point. The second point is that actually the new black swans are appearing on the horizon, exactly as Antonella pointed out. The first one, of course, we discussed already, Belarus, but I would put Belarus problem in a broader context. I think both Russia and the European Union are increasingly losing control over what is happening in their shared neighborhood. I think Ukraine crisis remains very much unresolved, and all the strategies which are used for that, on either side, has not really delivered very much, achievement for all these years. Secondly, of course, Belarus, a crisis that now going on for almost 2 months, we have not really seen any substantial, change or breakthrough. And we are about to face 2 more important elections in Moldova and Georgia. which could also be potentially quite divisive. And of course, other parts of the neighborhood, be it the Caucasus with Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, or even Turkey, Black Sea, Eastern Mediterranean, Libya, none of those areas in a kind of shared neighborhood, so to speak, or common neighborhood, actually have any substantial influence or solutions coming either from Russia or the EU. And therefore, I think tensions are likely to increase in the near future because both sides are addressing those challenges in a very tactical, short-term manner rather than trying to find kind of strategic vision and strategic outcomes. And final point is that actually interdependency between us has been reduced quite dramatically by COVID. And here I want to touch on energy issues, for example. Clearly, one of the big winners of this crisis is the renewable energy, which is one sector which has actually grown substantially during the crisis, while we all know that oil price, but also gas price has really collapsed, and the demand for carbon fuels is likely to decline quite substantially. And I think for Russia and the European Union, in the absence of any other foundation for bilateral economic relationship, be it technology or new investment, which has been in fact affected by sanctions, and generally kind of structural asymmetries between Russia and Europe. Ambassador mentioned the fact that Russian economy more and more depends on large state-owned enterprises, which is not, of course, the case in Europe, and therefore our cooperation is more problematic going forward. But in the energy sector, I think with this interdependency rapidly declining, and I think if we look, for example, at the UK, more than half of the electricity supply here will be generated from renewables by already 2025, and that is going to be repeated in many other parts of the European Union. We are simply not going back to the same demand for oil and gas that existed pre-COVID. And that will generate its own tensions. We know the Nord Stream 2 project is now very much in question. The Turk Stream project, in which Russia invested a lot of resources, is also in question now because it is half utilized and there is not enough demand. So in the absence of this economic interdependency, I think the price of further deterioration in the relationship and incentives of seeking closer cooperation would be even smaller. So the outlook, unfortunately, in my view, is rather negative. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Oksana. Thank you for the effort of saying so much in such a short time. I think maybe if I can add here a question for you. I would like to ask you, in this scenario, what do you think about the special relationship which has always characterized Russia and Germany? Do you see it at a turning point? Do you think that Kremlin would be willing to risk it with everything which is happening, and we know about from Navalny going to Nord Stream 2?
Yeah, I know that the other speakers will also talk about it. I'll just very briefly answer. I think we will not see any outcome of the forthcoming German elections next year, which could preserve the same level of importance or constructive outlook of the German-Russian relations as it exists now, even with all the caveats around the current challenges around the poisoning of important Russian opposition figure. Still, Angela Merkel, is committed or has been committed consistently in keeping this relationship steady and preserving kind of a balance. But I think whoever succeeds her, and of course, there's still a great deal of uncertainty over the outcome, undoubtedly will push for a more tougher line vis-a-vis Russia. And with that, of course, the overall common denominator within the European Union, where Germany did play an important role, is going to decrease vis-a-vis, what European Union would want to achieve in relationship with Russia. And more skeptical voices are likely to dominate, in my view.
Thank you so much. Well, you mentioned Ukraine. We have mentioned Ukraine, a country which we could say it has been hit twice by the COVID crisis itself and by the lack of attention, as we in Europe and the US are concentrating on our own crisis. Our next speaker, Professor Eric Jones, he is Professor of European Studies and International Political Economy at Johns Hopkins University. Reflecting on the economic crisis resulting from the pandemic, Professor Jones will help us understand the differences in the approach and the responses given even inside the Western world, as we in the European Union know very well. Please, Professor Jones.
Thank you so much, Antonella. I want to follow on directly from the last comment that Oksana made in her really excellent presentation of what's going on in Russia. And the point that she made is that we are not going to return to the same level of demand for oil and gas in the foreseeable future. And I want to build on that comment to make 4 different claims. One is about the scale of this economic crisis. Another is about the degree of divergence in the responses that have been made. The third is going to be about the implications of these 2 things, scale and divergence, for future patterns of trade and manufacturing. And then the 4th point is going to be about the implications for both asset and commodity prices. So that way I can come back around to Oksana's very excellent point. Look, the scale of this crisis is unprecedented, particularly when you consider how concentrated this crisis was. In the second quarter of this year, the US economy contracted by over 30%. So this is an enormous contraction in the US economy. And as we look ahead, the most optimistic estimates of where the United States will be put it at about 3 or 4% down in terms of real economic output. That would be a huge win for the US economy. By comparison, the European economy is going to be 9 to 10 points down in real output terms. So this is a huge crisis. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, in that context, how long is it going to take for us even just to get back to where we were before this crisis hit? And even in the US case, where the number is expected to be small, assuming that this second wave that we're experiencing does not have considerable consequences for economic performance and for the estimates that were made, even in the United States, it will take until the end of 2021 to bring the US economy back to where it was. And I will be honest with you, I think that estimate is extremely optimistic. In the US or in the European case, our ability to get all the way back to where we were prior to this crisis is going to drag into 2022. And again, I think that's an optimistic estimate when you look at the extent to which we're entering into a second wave. So I think that's going to put downward pressure on prices for those commodities like energy-based commodities that are used in manufacturing, simply because we're not going to recover the level of activity that we would require in order to bring those commodities estimates in the European Union, for example, rate is so deflation, and that's driven almost entirely by energy prices, which have just
Eric,
across, there's no sign of immediate difference. Yeah.
Your line is down. It's very difficult to listen to you.
You're unable to hear me?
Well, it comes and goes. Maybe no. If you just try because maybe it was just a moment. Maybe it would be better if you switched off the video if it goes on.
Okay. So me better now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Yes, please
okay. So,
try to go on. we will warn you if you will lose you again.
Okay. The point I was about the divergence policy response. I can make that point. You see it both in fiscal terms and in monetary terms. The fiscal divergence initially favored states and were much slower to organize a fiscal response. but now the United States is also experiencing considerable difficulty extending its fiscal response. And there may be difficulty in Europe extending a fiscal response as well, which means that most of the responsibility is going to be carried by national governments. And we know that, and you see that across Southern Europe, in particular, Southern European countries appear to be much harder than the North. It's not working, is it? Okay. Antonella, why don't you come on and I'll connect differently.
Sorry?
Why don't you move on to the next speaker, because if it's not working, it's not working.
Okay. Maybe we can try after a while to try again. All right?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Really sorry about that. Well, you were talking about energy, and we have already seen how important, how crucial this issue in particular is in this very moment, since energy is really, the approach to energy is going through a revolution, and maybe this crisis could also, in the end, result as an opportunity, not just a problem. I would like to give the word to Lapo Pistelli. Professor Lapo Pistelli is Executive Vice President of Eni, the Italian energy company, and he heads the international affairs for Eni. I think Professor Pistelli will take us in his intervention, will take us ahead of this crisis, since, as we said, this is a perfect storm, triggering recession, impacting on oil prices, but it also has accelerated the debate on energy transition. And Professor Pistelli will help us reflect on this, please.
Thank you, Antonella. You spoiled already some of the points that I want to make, but I'll try to go back to the beginning of the story.
Sorry.
In order to locate to position the energy point in this tragic global landscape that we were describing, because we are not, the crisis has not been overcome. Some countries are experiencing a second rebound. But what I would like to say as my first comment is that in 2020, we experienced the perfect storm. COVID was a disaster per se, but has been, first of all, I would like to mention this particular phase of the crisis, a societal challenge, because going beyond the number of deaths, we are more than 1 million, the COVID raised a number of societal existential questions. Is health a public good or not? So systems are reacting in different ways. Are we coming out from the crisis as individuals in a better shape or in a worse shape? Are we more cooperative or competitive among each other? And this reflects also a global question about the kind of leadership. We have seen more unilateral leadership reacting to the crisis in certain ways, and some other political leadership claiming for more multilateralism. So I agree with Oksana when she said that there's nothing new, and the COVID was able to speed up, to accelerate some existing trends. But we have seen after 1 year of the COVID, a first, I would say, balance on how the different political leadership and societies were able to react to the COVID. Under the societal umbrella, there is the economic disaster. So I don't have to give you numbers about recession, unemployment, and so on. I would like to emphasize, because this is relevant for energy, that we are experiencing, a number of new neologisms. Globalization is not anymore a globalization, is globalization, is a reshoring or nearshoring. So you can name it in many ways, but the basic phenomena is the disruption of the global value chain. And energy in many aspects of this business is a global value chain. So as a company, I can tell you, as an international oil company, we are operating in more than 70 countries. It was really a hard time because we experienced COVID in many countries of operation. We repatriate thousands of people in their home country. The supply chain was broken in many rings of the chain. So it's not only about numbers, but it's about the economic model that the COVID and the economic crisis leaves behind. And then you had the third element of the perfect storm, which was the price war between the Saudi and the Russia at the beginning of the year. That was a perfect final element of a perfect storm, because we added to a market which is by nature volatile an additional element of volatility. And if you see at the end of this year how the value of our shares are in the stock market, you will see that going beyond 5 or 6 big tech companies, which double or triple their profits in the last 7 months, all the commodity companies are down. All the international oil companies are losing from 45 to 55% of their values starting from January the 1st. So this is going to be very, very challenging. The second issue was, but what about transition? Are we going to speed up or to slow down? And I will be very brief about that, because the first reaction, I will mention the debate in March of this year, was we're going to slow down because the crisis is deep. So we have to save money and spend money for what is needed to recover. And so we don't have time and energy to waste talking about transition. Then in a couple of months, in different parts of the world, we experienced very tough political decisions about setting up enormous stimulus and rescue packages. And the biggest of this is the energy, the next generation EU and the recovery plan, and what was delivered by Brussels for the first time after 35 years of austerity. And so the reaction was the second one, which will be the direction of the recovery or the rescue? Are we going back to business as usual, or do we have to take this opportunity to change the model? And the decision was about changing the model. So it's not a paradox, but the transition, at least in terms of public debate, global debate, and policy making decisions, has been about boosting up energy transition and not slowing down, either on finding new sources of energy, either investing on breakthrough technologies. What I can tell now is that this is maybe my only personal comment, is that I don't see any need to advocate anymore about energy transition. The energy transition is already there. What we are risking now is to have over expectation about that. You see people saying, okay, we have to be carbon neutral in 2050. And then one politician stands up and says, no, by 2040. And then a third one says, not by 2035. What we need now is milestones, toolkit, and financial means to go there, and technologies, because it's not only by claiming that we have to speed up transition that transition will happen. It's not going to happen overnight, and the transition will have different impact, different pace, and different outcome depending on the part of the world. But the general trend is that we are speeding up. All of the companies are speeding up because of the new rules and because of the pressure coming from investors, stakeholders, public opinion, and media. And my third comment is about the triangle, Russia, EU, and US. And I have two comments. The first one, I see a concrete perspective of diverging policies among the three of them, because it's quite clear that EU has clearly chosen a way. I'm not saying this is the best one that is going to succeed. I don't know. I hope that we will succeed. I remember that in a symposium at the beginning of September, I would like to acknowledge the credit to this quote. A former prime minister from a Scandinavian country said, we need to avoid that what is trendy and fashionable today will be the write-off of tomorrow. So we have to be, sure that what we are doing is pursuable, that we can get there. And so we have chosen to be the vanguard of the transition. It's quite clear. It's about hydrogen, it's about renewables, it's about biofuels, it's about new limit to emission. We have to be aware as Europeans that from the energy point of view, we are an empty box. So we are buying from abroad. But we hope, because of this revolution, to be able to become the vanguard of the world, not only in terms of climate change, fight to climate change, but also in terms of a new form of supplying and producing energy. Then you have an interesting debate, which is the USA, because in the USA you can find, some federal decisions about allowing companies to drill in federal reserves, in federal wildlife park, and you have on the other extreme important states like California that have already decided by law to become carbon neutral in 2050. And last but not least, so we will see what's going to happen, because the election in November the 3rd can be a substantial watershed in terms of energy policies in the US. And then you have Russia, and I would like to say Russia is a very traditional player. Is a very traditional player. You all know that they are relying substantially for defining their national budget on this oil and gas bubble. They want to be the reliable supplier for China and Europe. But I see for Russia, not in the next 12 months, but in the next 10 years, yes, a substantial risk to become displaced from the energy transition debate. If they don't move, if they don't speed up their transition on renewables, if they don't diversify their economy. And we know how relevant, politically speaking, Russia is. And so I think that they have to make a better fine-tuning on the energy transition debate, diversifying their economic model. And my final comment in this third chapter about energy is about the role of gas in the EU, US, Russia triangle, because in the short term, this is going to be again the elephant in the room. We know that Europe is substantially dependent on Russia supply. The strange thing is that the countries which are the more dependent on Russian gas are the more vocal against the Russia supply, but that's it. What is true is that, notwithstanding with the liquefied natural gas, notwithstanding with is going to happen and is happening in the Med Basin, Russia is going to be there for the next 10 years in terms of supplying the European energy demand. And here you have a big and tough element of competition with the US policy, which is trying to enter the European market because of the negative price of their domestic gas. And we will see. It's clear that Nord Stream 2 has been the best case for debating and sanction and so on. But what I want to say is that going beyond the long-term issue, so how Russia will position itself in the energy transition debate, energy is for sure one of the more tricky and risky elements of the competition within this triangle, US, EU, and Russia.
Thank you very much. This is really interesting, and maybe I hope I'm not naive, but maybe the wish could be that Russia, as the biggest country in the world with all the resources for renewables that you could wish, could be not just for gas, but then again in the future for renewable, could have the same role, that the same connection with Europe that it has. That maybe it will, as you said, it will still have for gas, but also in this take part in this transition.
But if I can reply for 1 minute to this comment, because 2 years ago I was one of the 12 members of the first report made by IRENA, the agency for renewable energy, which is based in Abu Dhabi, about the geopolitical transformation of the energy transition. And one of the points, one of the many, but one of the points that was raised in the report is that usually in the oil and gas energy model, you have a typical commodity model where you have the country who are producing, countries who are buying and selling and long value chain. Traditionally, the more renewable you are, the more you tend to be independent, because you produce and you consume in the same place. So what will be incremented and really boost up by the energy transition will be the regional grids, trade between neighboring countries. And I would say the major threat to the energy security won't be anymore Hormuz Strait or Malacca Strait, but hacking the grid, hacking the smart grid. But it's a completely different model. But from my point of view, which is not only an energy point of view, is also a political point of view, quote unquote, I don't like to move from a model in which energy can be used to make pressure, to receive pressure, the oil for protection between the American president and the Saudi king in 1944, and the model in which everybody claims to be independent. Because when you become too much independent, I can say, your risk is also to become selfish. And when you are too much independent, you become selfish and aggressive. The interdependence among countries is the best way to preserve a cooperation model, a multilateral model. So, okay, good hope and good luck to renewables and to the issue that everybody can become a prosumer, a consumer, and a producer. But let's not exaggerate the geopolitical consequences of that, because otherwise, in a world in which everybody claims to be independent, there's no reason to cope with your neighbor.
Thank you so much. And so, as again, on this line of interdependence, I see Professor Jones has joined us back and changing the audio system. So I'm very pleased to give you back the word. We have switched on to energy, but the scenario is it's stayed the same. What you were talking about the differences in the approach on a more macroeconomic level, please.
Well, thank you, Antonella. I hope you can hear me better now. Can you hear me better now? Excellent. I realize we've lost considerable amount of time, so I just want to make two very simple points quickly. One is about the impact of this crisis on supply chains and trade patterns, and I think we're going to see that trade patterns are going to shorten and supply chains are going to shorten and multiply as we move toward a stronger resilience model. You see this resilience term come up again and again in the European Union funding proposals. You'll see it in the next stimulus package in the United States as well, as a consequence of which I think we're going to see a change in the way trade works across the system, which is going to add a structural element onto the point that Oksana made about the reduction in the demand for energy resources. The second point I wanted to make has to do with the nature of the stimulus that we've been relying on, which is primarily a monetary stimulus, and the injection of so much liquidity into the economy has had two very disturbing effects. One is to increase asset prices as investors holding on to this liquidity are looking for ways to get a reasonable rate of return. And the other is to increase volatility in key markets. And this is where I tie in, I believe, with Mr. Pistelli's comments about the volatility in oil prices, but we're going to see this volatility expressed across commodities and indeed across assets as well. And you're already starting to see that if you look, for example, at the market response to the news of Donald Trump's coronavirus infection. And you'll see that increasingly as there's divergence in central banking practices at the same time. So I think we need to pay attention to those structural changes in the economy, in addition to the scarring that the crisis has engendered. Thank you for coming back to me, Antonella.
Thanks to you, of course. So we move closer to America with Jeremy Shapiro, our last speaker in this panel. Jeremy Shapiro is the research director at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and this electoral campaign is not short of surprises, as we see. We move to America, but right away come back to Europe, because the choice the American people are facing will deeply affect, as we have seen already, our relations and relations with Russia. So I give the word to Mr. Shapiro. How do you see the opposing possible scenarios in front of us?
Thanks, Antonella, and thanks to everyone for having me. I've been at this conference a couple of times before. It seems quite different this year. I regret the inability to go to Rome and instead to do it in my apartment, but you know, there are some compensations to that, I suppose. I was a little bit intimidated by the topic of this panel, and even more intimidated by the excellent presentations. And I wanted to be a little bit more narrow and think about what the U.S. election, which I think is everybody is focusing on, particularly me these days, would mean for U.S. relations with Russia, but of course by extension, as Antonella said, to Europe. And it's quite interesting in this because to the extent that foreign policy has been in the campaign at all, it hasn't been much. It's mostly been about China, but the choice that the American people are making, whether they know it or not, on Russia is actually much starker than the one that they're going to make on China. Trump and Biden see Russia, and particularly its president, Vladimir Putin, in diametrically opposed ways. Trump sees a sort of strong man with whom he can make deals. Biden sees a reckless, cruel regime led by a dictator, and that's just essentially hostile to U.S. interests and Western values. And so I think that vision is what's at stake in the election, even if it's not what people are voting for. I find the Trump administration's approach over the last 4 years to Russia to be a pretty fascinating study in contradiction. In its details, the policy has actually been pretty close to the broad bipartisan consensus in Washington that Russia is a malign actor and that it's a national security threat to the United States. They have, maintained the sanctions. They've increased military assistance to Eastern Europe, sent arms to Ukraine. And if you look at the national security strategy that they released in 2017, it identifies Russia as both a strategic competitor and a revisionist power that threatens Western democracy. But all of this has really been undermined by the president himself. Trump has treated Putin and Russia with what for him is a very rare politesse, even deference. And unlike virtually every leader in the world, every other leader in the world, he's really never criticized him and even sided with him over his own government, for example, on the issue of the Russian interference in the 2016 election. He wants to readmit them to the G7. He's opposed congressional efforts to sanction them. And even in the speech that he gave introducing the hardline national security strategy that I just referred to, Trump barely mentioned the Russian threat, focused instead on how to establish a partnership with them, and mostly referenced Russia to crow about a congratulatory phone call he had with Putin over a foiled terrorist plot. In my view, these contradictions result in part from the constraints on the president created by the accusations of collusion and by the fact that he just never had people in place who shared his views of Russia and were willing to implement the policy that he wanted. And he's not very good at implementing policies himself. So far, Trump's Russia policy has basically been a product of political pressure, internal opposition within his own government, and bureaucratic incompetence. But that's not likely to persist into the second term. I think with the Russia scandal behind him, with the fact that most of the so-called grown-ups, the traditional foreign policy people, have left his administration, the Trump administration will be staffed in the second term with people who are increasingly willing and able to implement the policy that he actually wants on Russia. And you can already see this new breed of subservient staffers in, for example, the movement, the reprogramming of military assistance away from Eastern Europe toward funding a border wall with Mexico. And I think you'll see in a second term that Trump will still struggle with implementation. It's not his strong point, but he will be pushing forward, I think, on the effort that he's been talking about for years of establishing some sort of informal condominium with Putin's Russia. Biden is a complete contrast to that. He's really been a picture of consistency and antipathy toward Russia for decades. And that's really been reinforced by the Russian interference in the 2016 election. Biden wrote an article in 2018 in Foreign Affairs entitled "How to Stand Up to the Kremlin and Defend Democracy Against Its Enemies." And they lambasted, in that article, he and his co-author lambasted Trump for not taking the Russian threat seriously and advocated an alternative Russia policy based on more and continued sanctions, strengthening NATO, and most importantly, a robust defense of democracy. And that emphasis on defending democracy reflects, I think, an emerging view in democratic foreign policy circles that the new global struggle is between authoritarianism and democracy, and that Trump hasn't been even fighting that struggle. And that America must once again, in Biden's world, lead the free world to push back against rising authoritarianism. And this is a sort of extension of the Cold War paradigm that Biden came of age in. And it will require a US leadership to sustain a strong alliance of democracies in what will become another generational struggle against an implacable foe. So, I mean, that's the choice essentially in the 2020 election. It's not likely that either choice is going to be, I think people in Europe will feel differently about those two choices. As was mentioned, there's plenty of divides within Europe on Russia. But in my view, neither Trump's volatile self-absorption nor Biden's sort of Manichaean fervor when it comes to Russia really represents a very sound basis for Russia policy. And worse, I think it means that Russia policy is going to be a domestic political issue. So whatever choice the American people make in November runs the risk of sudden reversal by the next president. So in my view, Europe would be well advised to form its own policy on Russia and bring that to an American president. But I think, as has been discussed earlier, that has its own difficulties.
Thank you so much. Thank you for giving us this insight of something we are looking for the following weeks. It will be all our attention will be on this. I will give for a moment a word again to Chairman Tremonti. He wanted to intervene on the pandemic, please.
Oh, thank you very much. In October 2008, at that time I was Treasury Secretary. At that time, my vision was, it seems to me, to be inside a video game. Arrives a monster, you combat, you win, you are relaxing. Arrives another monster bigger than the first one. The reason of this vision. This is not a financial crisis originated inside the financial sector, subprime, but this is a general crisis. And why? The old classical world was based on liberté, égalité, fraternité. Suddenly, in 3 decades, global world moves from liberté, égalité, fraternité to globalité, marché, monnaie. A new world based on anomia and anarchy. The unique rule is the absence of regulation. What to do? At that time, our idea was move from pure free trade to fair trade. It's not sufficient to work on the effects. Is necessary to work on the causes, on the origin. And the tentative was drafting a global regulation on the production of goods and services. At that time was an utopia, but drafted in Rome and in Paris in the form of a multilateral international treaty, something similar to Bretton Woods, in 2010 voted by the General Assembly of the OECD. The alternative at that time was not global legal standard, but financial stability board. It's not, it's sufficient to put some regulation in the financial sector, not necessarily regulation in other sectors. The winner was the financial stability board. And today, in the pandemic times, could be good to go back to the old global legal standard treaty. In Article 4, you find regulation on hygienic and on environmental issues 10 years ago. Today, I don't see the end of this crisis. This is a general, this is an historic and never-ending crisis. It's not sufficient to work with all the means. It's necessary to change. The solution cannot be conventional, must be new or old. What's necessary is a new kind, a new version of the old Bretton Woods Treaty. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman Tremonti. We have a reply by Mrs. Antonenko we go back a minute for on the energy issue, and then we leave the word to our second panel.
Okay, thank you very much. It's not so much a reply, maybe just a comment a little bit to what Mr. Pistelli said, really excellent remarks about this energy transition and geopolitical impacts and how that could potentially benefit to some extent, relationship with Russia. But what I think one should also think about is the political impacts of energy transition, not just geopolitical ones. And for Russia, political impacts of energy transition will be, I would say, existential, because the way that the Russian political system currently works, it is based around the kind of redistribution of the energy rent, in a central way, to keep, all the parts of the country together. If we move towards much more decentralized system of generating electricity and generating energy at a local level, it will be absolutely impossible, I think, in the medium term to keep the far east of Russia with the rest of Russia already with a lot of tensions together. So hence, I think the energy transition is something which is Russia's views from the point of view of sort of skepticism, not only because of its own kind of inertia. They tend to always, deny the shale revolution or, revolution of the energy transition, but also because it will have a pretty fundamental political impact for Russia. But I think it is coming and unavoidable. So it is, challenging times, I think, ahead, in the next 20 years.
Very challenging times, indeed. I'm really sorry for not being able to listen to each of you for longer, or may have the possibility of making you so many questions that all your very interesting presentations make. But I think that we must leave the floor to our second panel, concentrating on all these geopolitical crises that we see multiplying in the world. Thank you so much to all our speakers.
Thank you, Antonella, and thanks to all the speakers. I think it was a very interesting and lively debate with a lot of suggestions. The fact that the energy transition is going to affect, for instance, the future of the political system in Russia is a key point, but also the idea, in my view, that we will have a reduced interdependence between Europe and Russia, with all the implications of that. We also heard, for instance, from Terracciano before, and from Antonella and from others, Oksana, that Germany, for instance, is going, in any case, to become a tougher interlocutor for Russia. So all interesting ideas. Now I give the floor to Armando Barruco. He's the head of the Unit for Analysis, Planning, and Historic Diplomatic Documentation at the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Armando, you have the floor for chairing the last session, please.
Thank you very much, Marta. And considering that we are a bit late, I will try to be as disciplined as possible. And I will also ask my co-panelist to actually hold with the same discipline that we have seen with the other panelists. And of course, you know, the focus of our session is very much on the three main actors that are actually affecting with the different degree of effectiveness and ability the changing Middle East. And of course, when we refer to the Middle East, we refer actually to the enlarged Mediterranean, and so to an area which is much broader and in which the interdependence within the different policies and the action of all regional and global actors are actually affecting the area and the local actor. I will start immediately with Andrei Kortunov, Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council, and with Andrei, in the past years, we have actually discussed several times about Russian foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, both in Moscow and in Rome and in Med dialogues and in different settings. And there is one constant argument that is always making, that is actually the MENA region is not a top priority for Russia. And there are other areas that are more important than this. But, you know, I don't know if this is true. This is still true, considering the kind of fault lines and the activity and mobility and of some other actors that is actually directly affecting also Russian interest in the Middle East. So, Andrei, what I'm asking to you is actually a review of Russian policy in the enlarged Mediterranean, not only the Middle East, but of course we speak also about Libya. And if you still concur with your argument that, okay, at the end of the day, the Middle East is not really a top priority for Russia.
Well, thank you, Armando. First of all, it's very nice to see you. And I have to say that we really miss you in Moscow. We hope that you will come
I really hope so.
To our part of the world. But I have to say that indeed, you know, I stick to the idea that the MENA region is not a top priority for the Russian foreign policy. It's not a major trading partner of the Russian Federation. It's clearly secondary to Europe and to China. Russia doesn't border the Middle East directly. It is not that much concerned about an inflow of refugees or migrants from this region. So essentially, Russia does not really depend on the Middle East the way, for example, the European Union does. We do not buy oil and gas from Middle East. And I would venture to say that even the Russian engagement in Syria, when it started, was primarily directed to make an impression on the West. It was geopolitical rather than it was guided by specific interests of national security. However, having said that, I would like to emphasize that this relative unimportance of the region gives Russia a significant comparative advantage, because Russia is not linked to its strategic partners in the Middle East, like, for example, the United States is. And therefore, it can afford a flexible approach. It can afford to have good relations with practically everybody in the region, be it Israel and Palestinians, or Sunnis and Shia, be it Iran and Gulf states, or Kurds and Turks. This is one of major comparative advantages that Russia enjoys. There are some other comparative advantages as well, and let me give you a list of them. First of all, Russia has a consistent foreign policy, and for this consistency, it is respected in the region. Of course, Russia can mobilize resources. It can power projecting capacities. It doesn't have checks and balances. And since it doesn't have them, it can make decisions fast and it can make decisions that imply mobilization of resources. I would also say that Russia has the luxury of what I would call moral relativism. It deals with leaders with whom probably some Western countries cannot afford dealing with. And Russia is good in personal diplomacy. And I would even say that there is some kind of natural complementarity between the Russian authoritarianism and the regional authoritarianism. Look at Russia's relations with European states. You can see that Russia has many more problems in Europe than it has in the MENA region. However, I think that today these comparative advantages might gradually erode and even disappear. In my view, Russia has a couple of very serious challenges in the region that might, to some extent, if not completely destroy, at least to inflate its current stature there. First of all, we see polarization. We see polarization, especially with Trump in power in the White House, polarization between the United States and Iran, between Israelis and Palestinians, between Qataris and Saudis, between Kurds and Turks. And basically, Russia is forced to make choices. And by making choices, it deprives itself of its most important comparative advantages. Second, I think that if the name of the game is no longer civil wars, but rather development, definitely Russia might lose this game to actors that have more capacity to provide development assistance. So Russia might win a war, it cannot win peace, even together with its allies like Iran and Turkey. And finally, the last but clearly not the least, I think that the Russian society is becoming more isolationist because of the pandemic, because of the economic recession. But basically, the Russian presence in Syria, though it is affordable in both blood and treasure, is no longer perceived by the Russian public as a major victory. More and more people start asking questions what we are doing there. So my take is that the Russian approach to the region is gradually changing. And I would illustrate this change by comparing the Russian approaches to Syria and to Libya. In Syria, the name of the game is the Russian hegemony. Russia, quote unquote, owns the country, takes a strategic approach to its engagement in Syria. In Libya, it's not about hegemony, it's about participation. And the Russian goals in Libya are more opportunistic rather than strategic. Russia does not try to punch above its weight in Libya, at least in my view. Second, I think that in Syria, Russia took a side. It's the central government against the opposition. In Libya, it's about balancing. Russia supports Haftar, but it also supports Sarraj, so it hopes to win no matter what happens in Libya in future. It is also about the interests. In Syria, it's about geopolitics. Syria is a poor country, it is under sanctions. Russia is not likely to get any economic benefits in Syria. In Libya, it's geoeconomics. Libya is rich. Libya can provide a good arms market for Russia. Energy cooperation is possible, infrastructural projects. So it's about specific economic interests. And finally, of course, in Syria, it's state. It's the Ministry of Defense. In Libya, it's what I would call a private-public partnership with the Wagner private military company playing the key role, especially in the east of the country. So if I were to think about the future, about the Russian engagement in the Middle East, I would say that probably Russia will follow the Libyan model rather than the Syrian model because it's more cost efficient. It does not constitute long-term commitments. And this is exactly what might be considered appropriate during the times of economic hardships and budget crunch. Finally, speaking of EU-Russia cooperation, and I don't have much time to do that, but I think that we do have some opportunities in Yemen. I think Libya will be difficult, but still less difficult than Syria. So my suggestion in terms of potential collaboration to start with low-hanging fruits, and apparently these fruits are in the south of the Arabian Peninsula. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrei. And if you allow me, but just for a very quick reply, I think that as Marta suggested at the beginning, it would be also very interesting for you to have, for us to have from you a very quick take on Nagorno-Karabakh. Also, because, you know, we are talking about, I understand your point about the different model, opportunism versus strategy, tactics for Libya, Syria, etc. But then we all see the kind of mobility and responsiveness of an actor like Turkey. And we see that more and more fault lines and tensions are actually rising between Russia and Turkey. So if you can actually, and of course, Nagorno-Karabakh has a very nasty side, which is actually, of course, the Christian Armenian versus the Muslim Azer. So if you can have just give us a little take on how you see from your perspective the crisis and the kind of consequences also for the Middle East and Mediterranean and the tensions between Turkey and Russia.
Well, a couple of points on Nagorno-Karabakh. First of all, it's a clear setback for the Russian policy and for the Russian intelligence. It seems that Russia was caught unprepared to face this crisis. Second, I think it shows that the Russian strategy of maintaining status quo for as long as possible has certain flaws. Basically, you cannot maintain this status quo forever. Sooner or later, it's going to explode. Third, I think that right now, it's no longer a problem which is contained by the borders of the former Soviet Union. Turkey is a major actor, and you cannot resolve this issue without some kind of understanding, hopefully positive understanding with Turks. Yet another point, you know, we in Russia, in Moscow, they often say that the real challenge, security challenge for the country is NATO and the West. But what we see right now, when it gets down to real problems, two major NATO countries and Russia found themselves in the same boat. So it's not about the West, it's about the South, where the real threats to Russian security are. Finally, let me say that I think that this crisis should initiate new thinking on avoiding double standards in international law implementation, because what is perceived in certain cases as the right for self-determination, in other cases is perceived as the supremacy of territorial integrity. So I think that this crisis necessitates a discussion, and Russia should not abstain from participating in this discussion in future.
Thank you very much, Andrei. I think it was very interesting to listen from a Russian point of view on the development of the crisis. Now I turn to the other actor of our actually session, which is actually Europe. And of course, any kind of reflection that our actually next speaker, who is Kadri Leak, Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And, you know, one of the things about the discussion about the Middle East is about where is Europe and what are the factors that are affecting Europe effectiveness and European policies effectiveness in the area. We, I think, have all listened with a lot of attention the sentence by the High Representative Josep Borrell about Europe who must learn to use the language of power. But the real issue is how you use power and what kind of power do you have. So, Kadri, from your point of view, do we have the instruments and do we have the cohesiveness actually to be an actor, an effective actor in the area?
Thank you. Thank you for including me here. I am not a Middle East expert, so my limited knowledge from the Middle East comes through my Russia expertise, trying to follow Russia's actions there. And looking at Russia's foreign policy in general, I think Russia's analysis of the Middle East has always been very good and probably better than Europe's. When you look at different areas of Russian foreign policy, what I notice, Middle East is probably the best because Russia has very good scholarship on Middle East and they use it. That is in demand by the Kremlin. President Putin doesn't think that he knows everything about sectarian conflicts in the Middle East, minorities and whatnot. He uses his experts, and there are experts everywhere in all branches of power, graduates of famous Moscow universities. So that knowledge is really very good, which cannot be said about other areas of Russian policymaking. About Europe and the US, also there is a wealth of knowledge, but it's often viewed through ideological lens, through the lens of geopolitical battle. And there aren't that many people who are out of it. Andrei is a great exception, but when you do the when you do the rounds in Moscow, very often you see people applying this filter and asking, whether the latest presidential election in Estonia was decided in Washington or Brussels. It seems incomprehensible to them, but it was actually decided in Tallinn and in a manner that wasn't very impressive. And about post-Soviet pace, I think Russia knowledge is worst of all. There is so much emotion and so little knowledge, and emotion drives policy. Knowledge is subordinate. Europe is a little bit in a different place. I think Europe probably applied this ideological filter to its view of the Middle East. It probably saw the Middle East through the lens of European experience, of democratization. And Arab Spring was viewed largely through that. The expectation was that once you remove tyranny, then democracy will take root. But it didn't happen so automatically, as already actually US intervention of Iraq should have shown us, but Arab Spring also brought it home. So to my view, European policy in the Middle East has not been very realistic. And actually what passed for our policy has suffered a bankruptcy long ago. Before, I would say, when Russia entered Syria. We often blame Russia for supporting Assad, for intervening with our policy goals. I think this is either incompetent or dishonest, actually. European policy or Western policy as such suffered a crash before that. So we probably need to acknowledge that Russia's analysis of the Middle East was better than ours. And right now we have very little leverage. By inertia, some of us still try to set demands to Russia, try to say that Russia needs to do this or that. And Russia, they don't take it well. I mean, some cooperation in Middle East would be possible on limited issues where there is an overlap of interest. I think it's quite indicative what President Macron has achieved vis-a-vis Russia on matters that concern Syria. He has presented his own vision, wanted Russia to subscribe to it. It didn't happen. So minor operations of humanitarian nature have materialized thanks to that, but no more. So I think we should accept it, that we have very little leverage. We should play it better. And even so, I mean, Russia will not change its policy because of our demands. Russia will stick to its own view of the Middle East and be ready to work with us where it sees it to be in its interest. It won't diverge from its own truths, and it also probably for the time being would not cooperate with us just for the sake of having cooperation with Europe. It's another story as to why that is so, why Russia lacks incentives to cooperate with Europe, why it doesn't believe that it might lead into something bigger, more interesting and more beneficial for Russia. I'd be happy to expand on that in the questions and answers, but for now I stop here.
Oh, thank you very much, Kadri. And yes, of course, we will see in the question and answer. But then you actually raised a point that is interesting. You know, I belong to one of those strands of Italian diplomacy, which is sort of ethical realist. Okay. And one of the things that actually is interesting, but it belongs to the previous discussion on the impact of coronavirus and on the relationship. It is, of course, you know, the protest. I'm not referring to the Arab Springs, of course, but I refer to the second wave. And so 2018 and what happened in Algeria, in Sudan, in Lebanon, and Iraq. And one of the impact of coronavirus was, of course, you know, the suspension of the protest for different reasons. Okay. Don't you think that actually this is something that is sort of frozen, but is there, and this is one of the features in which the EU has a comparative advantage towards Russia, in the sense that, of course, as our friend Andrei said, Russia has this sort of moral relativism and disability, this sort of very conservative kind of approach in dealing with power. And don't you think that, on the contrary, we have a comparative advantage in dealing with these movements and protests, in which, you know, we have a lot of diaspora also influencing the debate in these countries?
So can you clarify, how does coronavirus play a role in your question? You ask about protests, actually, about corona.
Yeah, actually, it stopped the protests in Algeria and of course, in Lebanon and in other countries. We had movements that didn't have anymore the streets and the squares. And so somehow they favor the status quo. And but in the moment that this will stop and the people will go again in the streets, because if there is no change, people will go again in the streets, the EU will have a comparative advantage actually in terms of a model, and the way we are actually coping with the coronavirus is a plus, the way that we have actually dealt. And that with regard to Russia, which is a conservative power, we have a comparative advantage in what we can do in the area.
Well, I think on coronavirus, the jury is still out. Who handles it better and what is better in the long term? The jury of both expert and public opinion. I've been working a little bit on how Russia has been coping with coronavirus. I interviewed some sociologists, and they are very critical of how Russia's healthcare system has coped with the virus in Russia, and probably quite unfairly critical, actually, because what I see happening is very much the same as in Europe. Planned operations are postponed, hospitals dedicated to corona patients. It's nothing exceptional, but people are critical of their own government and see it that way. So as to who handles it better and who is seen as having handled it better is, for me, it is too early to say. We have just seen the end of the first act. And in Russia, I think that has boldened the elite. They think that they have handled it better than Europe in terms of economics, at least, for reasons that were already mentioned: economic structure, more big enterprises, fewer small enterprises, easier to handle the pandemic, and so forth. But as concerns Russia, they definitely do not think that European system has somehow managed it better. And as concerns protests and how to handle them when they come back in the Middle East, also, I agree with you that European model is probably more sustainable, but I think it is really hard to export. European democracy, we have been trying to export it, and the results have been unimpressive. So democracy, I think, needs to be locally grown. And actually, one of the most interesting things about Russia these days to me is to see some embryonic vestiges of Russia's homegrown democracy taking root. Democracy that's not imported from the West, but that is emerging through trials and errors on Russia's own soil created by Russians. So I wouldn't be very optimistic about that too, which is yet not to say that something is wrong with European model or that we should lose all our self-confidence. No, we shouldn't, but we should be clever as well as humble on how we apply it.
Thank you very much, Kadri. And now I turn immediately to Nicola Pedde. And thank you very much for being with us, Nicola. And of course, you know, as we have been speaking about Russia, Turkey, and the situation of the Middle East, of course, there is to you that you are one of the major experts about Iran foreign policy. It would be very interesting actually to hear from you about the Iran vision towards Russia and the future of this triangle of interest and power in the region with Russia, Turkey, and Iran.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And well, Iran and Russia haven't been really friends. They were not before the revolution. And small progresses have been done after it. Relations between Moscow and Tehran after the revolution were built essentially on anti-Americanism. That's the limit, in my opinion, producing marginal results in terms of substance. Russia has always had reservation about the role of the Islamic Republic. And on the other hand, Iran has always looked with suspicion over Russia, Russia's strategy in the Middle East, Russia's interest in certain countries like Iraq, for example, in the past, but not only that one. In more recent times, the Syrian conflict has brought together the interest of both sides in the common military struggle in support of Bashar al-Assad, without this effort ever turning into a real form of cooperation. The disagreements between Moscow and Tehran during the conflict were not few, even if most of these disagreements have been ignored by the media. I can quote, for example, one which emerged in 2017, which was of particular relevance when Russians were invited by the Iranians to provide aerial support in Syria to support Iranian-led troops on the ground, because the Iranian parliament hasn't allowed the transfer of certain equipments of the Iranian forces on the ground. And basically, the Russians have been invited to open an airbase in Iran, in Hamadan. And when this support ended, they have been invited to leave the country almost immediately. So this created an embarrassment on both levels, because the Russians were convinced to having been invited to open a long-term presence in Iran, while the Iranians were quite in making it clear that this was only temporary. So this created one of the biggest problem during their cooperation in the war. But that's not the only side of the cooperation where there are problems. Another sensitive issue is the JCPOA, the agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action under the nuclear agreement, where the role of Russia is fundamental in the UN Security Council, but where once again, this role exercised more as an element of leverage in the relationship with the United States rather than a real instrument in favor of Iran. And so how Iran, does Iran look at Russia today? Well, the official dimension of this relationship is characterized by a quite enthusiastic narrative in terms of tones at the political level. Nevertheless, economic relations and political cooperation between the two countries are marginal, as well as on the cultural side, producing a modest exchange. And Iran has really no particular expectation from the relationship with Russia and is aware of the pragmatism of Moscow, within which the Russian position toward the region is articulated in particular. And on the social level also, and with this I will conclude, Russia does not represent in any way a model of interest for the Iranians, which on the contrary continue to look with great interest to whatever is offered by European and United States in terms of cultural and economic model, even despite Trump this. And this is, in my opinion, the real limit of this bilateral relation.
Thank you very much, Nicola. And if I can add just a little question also to you, a little more on Turkey and Russia. So I spoke before with Andrei and we'll listen to his answers.
Yeah.
But about Turkey and Russia, several fault lines.
I think that was just there.
Turkey and Russia, several fault lines, and for instance, in Libya.
Okay.
I think Kadri is...
You finished your thing?
Yeah, I finished. You finished.
I'm sorry, if you can mute, please.
No, I can't.
Okay.
Thank you.
So with respect to Turkey and Russia, especially in Libya, I think that Turkey and Russia's involvement in Libya is characterized by two peculiar differences. I agree with what Andrei said with respect to the fact that Middle East, the MENA region in general, is not relevant or not that much relevant for the Russians. Well, first of all, Turkey is there to stay. That's the first and probably most important element that is characterizing this presence, and as a strategy to consolidate its long-term interest in Libya. Ankara has invested considerably on both political and military factors, and this is within the framework of its regional strategy. Turkey's strategy and posture in Libya is thus consistent with its overall strategic vision. It's visible, it's tangible, and this is, in my opinion, the most important element on the Turkish side in characterizing the Libyan strategy. Turkey is becoming even more aggressive in defending its own spaces, while on one side is trying to negotiate with Russia and the Emirates the limits of its sphere of influence, the sphere of, let's say, the sphere of actions on the ground, at least on the east. Ankara is as well becoming aggressive with those on the west, and in particular with us, with the Italians. So it's really redefining the overall strategy over in Libya. Probably is less problematic its relation with Qatar, also because Qatar is characterized by a non-confrontational posture toward Turkey. Well, on the other side, for Russia, in my opinion, Libya is more an opportunity rather than a strategic interest. Moscow is spending peanuts in Libya and gaining a huge result. It operates on the ground through an extremely well-equipped private military company, the Wagner, which have been already mentioned by Andrei, which is adopting the maximum capacity of deniability of its own role. So Russia can always deny that it's actively involved in Libya, while it's providing Wagner equipments and weapons which are clearly of governmental origin. Wagner has been provided with equipment which are not usually adopted and used by PMCs. Russia has no long-term interest over Libya. But it's actively using Libya in a sense, in terms of capacity within to gain results capable of producing enormous advantages with both the US and Turkey, and eventually consolidating its role in the Eastern Mediterranean. So the local perception, in my opinion, is this: while Turkey is present, is there, is visible and tangible in terms of activism and political participation, Russia is less visible, less perceivable from the Libyan, let's say, society and within the Libyan context, and it's not investing in long-term strategies on the ground.
Thank you very much, Nicola. And now I turn to my colleague, Chris Robinson, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Russia in the Department of State. And I would say, you know, I think that you have been listening to all the intervention, etc. So I think the fact that you are the last speaker is actually very, very much an excellent opportunity for all of us. First of all, because actually you have time to react to the different arguments. But perhaps I think the most important thing for us, considering your position, has to do with the US take on Russian activities in the Middle East and in general on Russia foreign policy. Of course, we have all in mind the 3rd of November and what it will mean, etc., etc. But perhaps if there is one field in which there will be no big change in US foreign policy, it could really be perhaps the Middle East. But the jury is out on that. So please, Chris, I leave the floor.
Armando, thank you very much, and good morning from Washington. And thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the Centro Studi Americani for organizing today's forum, for the opportunity to participate. And again, also thank you to Italy. And I think it's a great, discussing Russia and the Middle East, it's a great topic to be discussing virtually, at least with Rome, because Italy has been such a leader on trying to advance peace and stability in the Middle East, particularly in Libya, where it is a frontline state. And so I think the discussion is really apt. And like so many other speakers, I can heartily say I wish I was there in Rome and not in Washington today. But I really did appreciate the opportunity to listen to the other speakers, and particularly to see and hear from Andre. And maybe I can comment, sort of juxtapose or offer an alternative view from Andre's scenario and depiction of Russia and the Middle East. I think very simply, the US and European partners agree, and let's focus on Libya and Syria, because I think it's a good way to talk about the broader Middle East, North Africa challenge and context. But US and our European partners agree that there's an urgent need to halt the conflicts in the region, and that the way to do so is either through the UN facilitated Berlin process for Libya or UN Security Council Resolution 2254 for Syria. But let's turn and look at Russia, and I really see a different picture from what Andre pointed out. Unfortunately, instead of working to uphold and implement those UN commitments and resolve conflicts, what we could see is a pattern of malign behavior from Russia. Russia publicly commits to these agreements and then works to undermine them and advance the Kremlin's narrow interests, I think, to the detriment of solving these conflicts. Rather than working towards a negotiated solution for peace and stability, Russia ultimately, and it goes back to the geopolitical context, is undermining the rules-based international order, exacerbating tensions, exploiting international conflicts for its own narrow political, and I think, as others have touched upon, economic gain. So on Syria, we continue to engage Russia publicly and privately to find a solution to the conflict in Syria in accordance with the UN-led process. We do have a very robust dialogue, government to government, with Russia on this. And it's delivered some limited results on deconfliction and so forth. But what we actually see in practice is Russia propping up the brutal Assad regime, shielding it from accountability for its use of chemical weapons against its own people. Moreover, and I think this has already been touched upon, Russia has introduced significant weapon systems with questionable military necessity into the conflict, risking escalation and undermining attempts to find a political solution to the conflict. Instead of working to resolve the conflict, in fact, Russia appears to be treating Syria as a showcase and a proving grounds for Russian weapon systems in order to encourage their sale across the broader Middle East. Russia's leveraged its role in Syria to deliberately undermine the foundations of the rules-based international order. For years, Russia has conducted a disinformation campaign to discredit international organizations working on this conflict, such as the United Nations and the OPCW. Even more specifically, Russia's leveled ludicrous claims that the United States, for example, is responsible for the creation of ISIS, that the white helmets have links to terrorism, or that UK special forces fabricated the 2018 chemical weapons attack in Douma, or more recently, that the US is responsible for the spread of COVID in Syria, going back to the previous panel's discussion. These are not the actions of a state that is credibly seeking to resolve conflict and build regional stability. Now let's turn to Libya, and we see the same pattern of behavior. We're likewise concerned about Russia's role in exacerbating the conflict in Libya. In particular, Russia's fueled the conflict by deploying its so-called proxy mercenary force. I kind of enjoyed Andre's characterization as public-private partnership. It kind of made me laugh. It's usually not the way we think of public-private partnerships. But it's a proxy mercenary force, the US-sanctioned Wagner Group. Russia's role and its introduction of advanced military systems has escalated the civil conflict, undermined the reconciliation process, and frankly, it's enforced a prolonged shutdown of the oil sector. And while it's gradually reopening, it still can't operate in critical areas due to the lingering presence of Wagner forces around critical infrastructure. And so just like in Syria, we've called on Russia to support the UN-led process to find a political solution that advances the interests of the Libyan people. But again, like in Syria, instead we see that Russia continues to attempt unilateral efforts at diplomacy while using Wagner as a coercive tool to stoke instability until its goals are met. And a couple of the other panelists talked about Wagner, and I think it's a really critical element, and it's an emerging element that we've got to get right for stability and security in the broader Middle East and elsewhere. Wagner is a tool of the Russian government and exists only to drive Russian foreign policy goals and enrich its corrupt owner, Yevgeny Prigozhin. Russia's actions make clear its interest is not in solving the conflict, but let's get right down to what the real goal is, because Andre pointed that there really isn't a primary goal. It is a geostrategic goal to establish a military foothold in Libya from which to threaten Europe, to threaten NATO and Europe's southern flank. So we are alarmed that Russia might use its presence in Libya to expand the platform of malign influence across the broader Middle East. And again, we sanctioned Yevgeny Prigozhin last week for his activities in the Central African Republic because we see a pattern of behavior of destabilization and engaging with certain regimes to trade access to extractive industries in order to prop up certain regimes. A couple of the other panelists talked about what we can do to influence Russian behavior, and I think there are things that we can do. The US and the EU have joined together, both through our statements and sanctions, to call Russia to account for these actions and blunt Moscow's efforts to exert malign influence. We, using our authorities, have sanctioned over 350 individuals under various sanctions regimes, and we are continuing to work with Brussels to do the same thing. And particularly in this context, I would argue that if Europe wants to see an end to conflict and instability across the Middle East and North Africa, then our recommendation is Europe should use its sanctions authorities against Prigozhin and his network to cut off Russia's agent of instability and chaos in the regime. We can talk about the president's efforts with NATO to get NATO to do more in the Middle East and expand its activities there and strengthen stability. But in conclusion, I'd like to say that I think it's not too late to stress for Moscow to change its course and in the Middle East and to genuinely support political solutions and settlements to the conflicts instead of fueling instability. Others have commented where we have overlapping interests. I think we can have that overlapping interest, but it's really for Russia to match its words to its actions. And we'd like to see an end to the destabilizing behavior. And if we can do that, then we can strengthen those UN-led processes and get back to solving some of these conflicts. So let me stop there, Armando, and thanks for facilitating the discussion. And I'm ready to answer questions or have a further discussion.
Thank you very much, Chris. Now I revert to Marta, who is a sort of director of the discussion, just in the sense to see if we have a little more time to go on with some cross question and answer.
Yeah, in theory, yes. I think that we can stop at 6:15. That means in 10 minutes, maybe if I can ask.
Absolutely.
Please right away, a more general question. We have been discussing the US policy and the European policy vis-a-vis Russia more in general terms, if you wish, leaving aside the Middle East per se. So I don't know whether you listened to Jeremy Shapiro before, discussing the two alternative options the United States have in front of Russia. So if you can leave us with a flavor of your general perspective on Russia, that would be very helpful.
Sure, sure. And look, I'm a career diplomat. I'm a career foreign service officer. And I've worked on Russia over actually every US administration since 1995. I've had the opportunity at one point or another to work on Russia policy. And I think there is a pretty broad bipartisan consensus on the challenge Russia poses to the United States and to Europe, to our values, and to the architecture that we've built to sustain them. I'll be frank, I don't think anybody wants a confrontational relationship with Russia. Even when we talk about great power competition with Russia and China, we also talk about trying to manage that great power competition, reduce the risks in that great power competition. So the president's been clear, we would like a better relationship with Russia. We would like a more stable relationship with Russia. That's in the US interest, it's in Europe's interest, if that relationship could exist. The challenge is whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in the Donbass, whether it's in cyber attacks around the world, we see a sustained pattern of Russian malign behavior where it doesn't recognize the limits to interference or the limits to using all the instruments of state power to achieve the Kremlin's narrow political and economic interests. I think they are different from Russia's broader interests. I think it's in Russia's interest to have good relations with the West. I think it's in Russia's interest to have normal trade relations and not to have sanctions. But what we see is a pattern of behavior that works against that. And so I think we have challenges ahead across the board in that relationship. There are opportunities for cooperation, counterterrorism, it was already mentioned in part. I think arms control provides an opportunity to hopefully reach agreement with Russia over time that can address some sources of strategic stability concerns. But the big concern I see, and again, while I focused on Prigozhin and the role of Wagner in the Middle East, is this pattern of malign influence and malign activity where Russia tries to seek plausible deniability, yet it really goes at our core values, our systems, and our national security, and the health and safety of our own people. I mean, the Navalny incident alone are enough to talk about why we really have to address the pattern of malign behavior if we want to see a better relationship going forward. And I think regardless of who wins in November, the US foreign policy will still be focused on how to address that.
Thank you very much, Chris. And if I can add actually a question to what Marta was saying, and actually to your list of possible areas of dialogue or contact with Russia. What about collective security in the Middle East? You remember actually the Russian proposal 4 or 5 years ago, and this is something that is sort of dear to us because actually it came, the first one actually to resurrect the idea of a conference for security and cooperation in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean, was actually our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Gentiloni. And then it came again a proposal from the Russian about the idea to use the model of the CSC to actually build something to build a system of, to start building a system of collective security in the Middle East. And playing the devil advocate, there was almost no reply from any side, I would say, not only from the US side.
So, you know, and I know that, we can go back in time, even after 9/11, that I know that in the Bush administration, there was a discussion also of using the CSCE model, or at least the principles involved from that time, to whether we could apply that to the challenges of the Middle East. And I think those efforts haven't entirely worked. I think one of the challenges, to be very blunt, in terms of when we deal with the Russian role in the Middle East, is the issue of words versus action. So Russia will make written commitments And CSCE is a challenge. The Helsinki Final Act is a foundational document anchoring in certain commitments that really brought about transformation for European security and enshrined certain values into the architecture of European security. Yet Russia on a daily basis violates those. And so I think you're going to find a challenge of, certainly from the US side, of engaging in some of these agreements when we see on the ground behavior that really works against it. I don't exclude that. Again, we are engaged in dialogue on certain these challenges. We are working through the UN process on some of the other challenges. So I think there's space, but it really comes down to words versus actions when we deal with Russia. And certainly since 2014, we have seen, and you could maybe argue go back to 2008 and the invasion of Georgia, that we see a pattern of behavior that makes it very difficult to believe in Russian words, and where we need to see a change in behavior, not just the words.
Thanks, Chris. Armando, maybe we could ask Andrei to give his more or less reply, I would say, on these issues, especially about this gap between deeds and words. What do you think, Andrei?
Well, thank you. Chris gave me an opportunity to talk a little bit about the malign activities of the United States in the region. I think that indeed the core problem that we face in the Middle East is the confrontation between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States. All other factors are important, but not as central as this one. So my take is that in order to bring peace to the region, the United States has to change its malign activity. Specifically, I would strongly suggest that the United States should get back to JCPOA, and I hope that the Biden administration will be more receptive to this idea than the Trump administration, which unilaterally withdrew the United States with JCPOA by violating the appropriate United Nations Security Council resolution. Second, I would suggest that the United States should abstain from malign activities like assassination of a high-level Iranian official on territory of a sovereign state, together with a number of Shia leaders in Iraq. I don't think that this attitude is appropriate. I don't think this behavior is acceptable. I also believe that the United States might slightly change its very biased approach to the relations between Israel and the Palestinian state. And I know that many European nations would agree with Russia on its position on these specific issues. I would also suggest that the United States should not twist arms of its European allies, trying to impose on them the unilateral sanctions which the United States now imply, especially as far as the Islamic Republic of Iran is concerned. I think that if you meet at least this very limited and modest list of suggestions, it would be much easier for us in Russia to convince our leadership that it should also change its behavior in the Middle East and it should become a part of the solution rather than a part of the problem. Thank you.
Andrei, so I need to go back to Chris now, no? Chris.
Marta, I would say this is very interesting, and I saw you smiling because it's actually, as you are one of the main experts of Russian-US relations, this is very Cold War vintage kind of that actually I would say, and I leave to Chris actually if he wants to reply, but you know, the whole idea of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe was very much about the confidence building measures. And from the kind of exchange that you just had, this is really what actually would be really needed in the area. But I leave it to Chris if he wants to reply.
Chris, can you also say a few words about Nagorno-Karabakh? Is that the area where we can see US-Russian cooperation now?
Hey, let me take that one on, in fact, because I think it is a potential. I think you saw the statement from the three presidents yesterday. We are very committed to the Minsk Group process, and I think that speaks to the U.S. engagement in constructive processes. We're very active, and we'd like to see a settlement here. We've called on both sides, and we are engaged trying to encourage a ceasefire and to make sure that no foreign actors are involved to escalate tensions. And I think that's important. The Minsk Group provides a way forward. and we are very committed to that. So I think that does speak to a potential that there are ways for confidence building measures. There are ways for the United States and Russia to address an ongoing conflict. We hope Russia will also use its diplomatic engagement and economic influence to help encourage a rapid ceasefire here for both sides. And I think that points to the opportunities for working together. Again, it depends on what the facts are and what we see in the actions.
I don't know, Marta, if you wanted to say, because this is a sort of silver lining from the whole discussion, but I don't know if you wanted to say something actually at the end of the debate and just a sort of conclusion on what we just discussed. Because I think, the first panel, you can see some elements that especially the impact of COVID and energy transition and the changing geopolitical landscape of energy, etc. Here with this panel, you can really see actually the three actors, the EU a little bit in the background, but the two main actors, the US and Russia, still actually having a contested perception of different responsibility and role in the Middle East, and the need for these two actors, perhaps also with our help and support, to actually to discuss and dialogue even more than they are doing now. But I leave it to you actually, if you have something more to add.
Chris, if you don't feel like adding anything else to what Andrei replied to you, and we leave it as it is, so as to show how the gap is wide still, and how far we have to go to build up mutual trust between the US and Russia, and certainly Europe has to play a role in all that. I have to say that being part of the NATO reflection group, trying to present a report to the Secretary General on the way in which a political NATO can be built up. And we have Wes Mitchell, whom you know very well, Chris, as our co-chair in the group. I have to say there are major differences on how to deal with Russia. This is one of the topical points we have to confront. And the real problem is whether the second track engagement is to be conceived as a reward to Putin and to these misbehaviors we were mentioning before, or engagement is the way to anchor Russia to a more constructive security situation in Europe. So the two positions, if you wish, are on the table. We will try to find a solution to that. But in any case, there is no doubt that how to deal with Russia remains nowadays one of the major political and foreign policy challenges we have to confront in Europe, in NATO, in the relationship between the US and Europe. Now, in a sense, the climate is suspended. Clearly, the elections are going to have, in the US, are going to have a huge impact, even if you mentioned, Chris, the fact that there is a sort of bipartisan consensus on many foreign policy issues, including Russia, but notwithstanding, my feeling is that we will have nuances in this policy. I don't know whether you saw the two letters that the American experts produced on Russia, with a big difference, especially on this point, whether we can decide that engagement is in our interest, in the Western interest, or not. In any case, this has been, and I thank all of you, all our friends from all over the countries, for having taken part into this debate. I think it was a very interesting one, as usual, and many thanks to the Center for American Studies and to the European Council on Foreign Relations. We stay in touch. We will organize other events. I do not abandon the hope to be able to meet in person in Rome. That would be much better in a sense. And thanks again. And we will see each other next year for the 6th edition of this forum. Goodbye. See you.